Okay, thanks. Uh, yeah, this is sort of true to the name, sort of half-baked in that there's lots of ideas, there's lots of things going on with it. I don't know exactly where they all belong yet, but hopefully there's something of interest that we can sort of chew in a bit. Uh, I'm going to talk mostly about cocktails as the examples, though my sense is that everything I say actually runs directly into food, and that though I sort of think in those terms, and sometimes cocktails work out a bit cleaner, but generally speaking, I think what I want to say about recipes would apply directly to food as well. Uh, Also, some things I'm saying, if you're familiar with this literature, particularly with sort of the metaphysics of recipes, I'm not saying much that's particularly new. I think I'm just saying it in a different order and that I'm sort of keeping it in place. So some of the sort of negative claims I want to make about the structure of the debate are perfectly well recognized, I think, by everybody in it. But if you look at then where the views end up and the things that they say, I think they've sort of forgotten some of their own parameters or that they sort of ignore these things. So it's sort of a simple point. And then the positive part in uh what I've got on my aims here under two and three, those I'll look at custodianship. I probably won't talk about naturalism because I don't think I have time at all. But so the first part is sort of setting up issues with recipe identity debates, and then talking a bit about this custodianship role under the new sort of disambiguation. All right, let's see if this. It's kind of a quasi handout slides. All right, so we open with a nice sort of tasty vignette. Here is the story of the Sazerac to date. Um, It was roughly 1938 or 1838, sorry, when the New Orleans apothecary owner Antoine Peychaud started adding his eponymous bitters to cognac, and in so doing, the Sazerac was born. In the years that followed, a sugar cube was added, an absinthe rinse became the norm, and then a lemon peel found its way into the mix. By 1850, the Sazerac was a hugely popular cocktail and a staple of a great many New Orleans coffee houses, which is the name they had for bars. It's very, trying to get away with something. Then, when French vineyards were plagued with insect infestations and the cognac supplies dried up, American rye whiskey was brought in to replace it. Fast forward to the 1880s, and the affordability and availability of rye whiskey fuels the spread of the Sazerac across the US, and there's a massive spike in popularity. A few more years go by, and absinthe is banned for allegedly causing hallucinations, madness, and violence, followed shortly thereafter by the dark days of prohibition. 13 years later, cooler heads prevail, and the wormwood-free anise spirit herb saint is brought in to replace the absinthe, so that, less violence, resulting in the Sazerac we know today. So there's a nice long story there about how it starts out, where it changes, and various manipulations. A few basic questions. When was the Sazerac created? What happens if somebody creates a cocktail like the Sazerac but uses cognac, or a lime twist, or even some of the good old Green Devil absinthe? And quite frankly, why can't I make a Sazerac with rum if I bloody well want? Who makes the rules here? So I offer two views in this space. They are recipe origin naturalism and recipe custodianship. They'll help give some answers to these questions, but mostly, as I say, I want to set out what the questions are. Okay, here's a common background found among nearly everybody in the debate who's talking about recipes. Uh, so there's lots of disagreement about the correct theories, but there's a sort of standard base metaphysics that everyone is using. That takes a recipe to be a set of instructions. They're instructions that leave out a huge amount because they don't specify exact skills. They don't specify, in many cases, specific ingredient choices. They only give genera. Precise actions are sometimes included, but rarely not. And so leniency is the basic hallmark of recipes. They themselves are abstract entities. Cocktail, in this case, typically refers to a beverage type and not a single drink. The parallel, if you're used to the food recipe case, is a dish. I also introduce a term that I think we use and need in this sort of metaphysics space, which in this case is a drink, which is a token cocktail. It's the consumable single serving entity, normally in a vessel. In parallel, there isn't a term in the food space, but I think that we should speak and start speaking of something like a plate, which is a single token instance. I think that's just handy for navigating the literature. Recipes and cocktails are interdefined. The recipe wouldn't be the recipe it is were it not for the recipe to be for a particular type of cocktail. And the cocktail wouldn't be what it is without the recipe for it. They are the sort of, I like to say, the thunder and lightning of mixology. You're approaching really what's a kind of a single thing from two different sides in two different ways. Granted, there's different features and different aspects, but they are intricately tied into each other. Uh, this is something of a dangler, but I'll mention it anyway. If we just think about the features that they have objectively, so various tastes, the way a various cocktail looks, the shape of it, the vessel, alcohol content, ingredients on the other side, process, cooling, whatever things we go through, these all carve out a wide but definable objective similarity space. And when you then combine the fact that the identities of the two are tied into one another, you get what I think of as a kind of dumbbell shaped restriction in terms of similarity space for the various kinds of entities. It's rough, it's got rough boundaries. This isn't well circumscribed, but if you would compare that large sort of dumbbell shaped entity, if you will, to other similar types of things, you find that they're quite different. So, I mean, the sort of pure objective differences between different cocktails and their recipes is not as badly mapped out as I think is often considered and discussed. It's typically, I think, taken that the objective space is too unwieldy. And I think it's just very large, but I think it's got more shape than it's given credit for. Okay, that's the basic background. So, where are things at in terms of the debate? Let's talk through the two major views. There are a couple of other views out there, but they get short shrift, and I think for good reason. Though if I'm sort of being unfair to those and someone wants to bring up reasons why I should give them a little more time, so be it. All right. The probably leading view at this point is constructivism. Recipes require an act of human fiat to come into existence. According to the constructivist, who most of the time actually is Borghini, but he's not the only one. Recipes are the outcome of a selection process ultimately guided by fiat, such that the identity of a recipe isn't tied to any process or ingredient. In order for a recipe to exist, its human creator must recognize it as such, a fact typically realized through some sort of performative utterance, such as a speech act declaring, I call this a paper plane. So, like wedding vows, there is a performative element, typically what I like to call a baptism, that's an intentional act that both brings a recipe into being and gives its name. Few caveats. It needn't be an utterance per se. It's really the intention that matters. Uh, Intention is a necessary feature of bringing recipes into being, but obviously there's a lot more than just the fiat act. And it's part of the view that the declaration needs to come from someone with a person with suitable training. So, you can't just be a pure neophyte and come in and be the one who is determining or originating a recipe. Very briefly, this is too briefly to be fair, but just sort of runs through what's going on in the literature. Some of the pros and cons of these kinds of views. So it's offered in support of this that this method of recipe origination is common, especially among professional mixologists and chefs who will edit and review dishes until they are happy with the product. Once they hit a certain stage, they then, baptize and launch it. Other arguments offered in favor of constructivism often speak into what I call downstream identity concerns. Those are things post origination. It's often brought up that it's beneficial in a theory of recipes to be able to deal with certain kinds of legal disputes, which obviously downstream identity concerns. It leans into the belief that recipes can evolve. So if you are a fan of the idea that recipes can change over time, then the constructivist is sort of better suited for this. It handles cases where dishes are named for a personal role, and that person can swap in ingredients as they see fit, such as a chef's salad. And it claims to accommodate social, cultural, and historical features of recipes. Allegedly. I'm not actually totally sure how it does that. But so be it. Okay. Cons, it rejects accidental recipes, lost recipes that we seem to just have that lack obvious authors. It doesn't do well with what I call wild recipes, where things just appear in nature and are consumable foodstuffs or drink stuffs. Likewise, for things that we might reverse engineer back from something, or those who lack proper training. I also think it overstates the role of originators. In many cases, the space of permissible changes for a cocktail is just not something that an originator is thinking about. So somebody who generates a recipe and generates the dish or cocktail that goes with it probably isn't in any way at all thinking about what does this drink have to have such that another drink entity is exactly the same type of this drink entity. It's very rare that that goes on. In fact, if you look at a lot of recipe book creations, say, a lot of the times those are made up on the fly for things that are being done in a much more generalized and non-specific kind of way. What's important, and I'll just sort of note, because this is ultimately where we're headed, is the difference in these arguments between what concerns origination or creation of recipes and problems that have to do with downstream identity concerns. And, stealing my own thunder, I mean, this is a real mixed bag of identity questions. Okay. The realist on the other side of the fence claims that the identity of a recipe depends on nothing more than the ingredients and the method of preparation. I sometimes prefer to call this view sort of objectivist, given that realism often has ties to things like features of Platonism and such, and there doesn't appear to be much of that going on in the realist literature. They eschew the human environment in determining recipe identity, so no person needs to speak them into being. The dish is a type whose members fall into a class of objectively similar plates or drinks. The dish's identity thus lends itself to the identity of the recipe. It's not to say that they can't be brought into existence via fiat, just that the methods of origination are much wider than the human restricted cases. Realism comes in degrees, degrees determined by the level of rigidity in the sameness relation. So what is really, I think, a combination of some form of objectivism plus various kinds of essentialist features is about how features of the cocktail are fixed in terms of the sameness relation. So whether or not you need to have some degree of sameness or whether a minor degree would do. Okay. So hardcore realists fix an exact set of ingredients. So you have whatever ingredients are given for the particular cocktail. Sameness is a matter of a perfect match in terms of that, or perhaps the procedures. Moderate realists limit that to some sort of core set of those. There are also some ancestral realists who step aside from the essentialist structure, but instead give you familial relations in very much a kind of evolutionary tree model. So as long as two instances have shared ancestry or stand in some chain of parent and offspring relations, then you're fine in terms of there being the same cocktail. All of these, sort of run into various kinds of problems. Some of which, I mean, we don't really need to dive into them now because I mostly care about the shape of the debate. Okay, so pros, it's great for unintended and wild cases. It's all the things that the constructivist misses out on. Animals who might have recipes. I'm always fond of the picture of children having recipes. It's I always think about children just sitting on the floor, pulling things out of the cupboard and creating things. And not that I recommend one go and drink that, or that you let your children play with, bottles of alcohol. But you can get recipes in there. There are drinks. They might not be good drinks, but cocktails are made. It also does very well with any kind of protected product. So GI is typically the way that anybody who wants to preserve uh, any kind of recipe or foodstuff or cocktail immediately sort of gloms onto a sort of an essentialist approach by fixing certain things and saying that they can no longer change, and that to be one of those things is fixed by either by the ingredients or by the location. Uh, and it's really good, for found and reverse engineering. The cons, just sort of the flip side of what's going on with constructivism. Um, you probably shouldn't order a chef salad if you're some sort of realist. I think there are, okay, so I mean, there are responses to all these in that you might start to say, well, okay, well, if the chef salad is really uh, defined by the individual who's making it and can have any sorts of ingredients in it, then maybe these are all just recipe subtypes that fall under a more general recipe structure, which is whatever the chef wants. So you can respond. Uh, they don't do so well with change and evolution of recipes. If a recipe is tied to certain features, then either evolution undermines the realism or demands a more complex response. So here you can have distinct recipe subtypes plus some sort of explanation of what unifies them. Again, you have to move up, you get a more complicated theory. It's not embracing evolution, but it's giving you a sort of metaphysical structure that allows you to answer how it is that different recipes fall under the same type. And conversely, versions that handle evolution struggle with non-identical lineages. Um, so the history said, well, I mean, I'll briefly mention the Negroni. So the Negroni grows out of the Americano when there's a demand or a request for something that's a stronger drink. So the Americano then, which has seltzer, losing it. Anyway, gin comes in and we get a shorter, stronger drink. Later, you get the incorrect Negroni that replaces the gin with Prosecco. The worry here is that, so you've got this lineage. If you've got a lineage view that says that you have identity in a case where you have these kinds of family relations, well, we're now running against the fact that you seem to have family relations for a perfectly good historical run of drinks, but the cocktails are treated separately. So when you hit these kinds of problem areas, you're running into different kinds of solutions in different kinds of cases, and they seem to run against each other. And lastly, it seems to struggle with non-objective features of similarity, subjective, cultural, personal features that sometimes determine boundaries of sameness and continuity. Okay. Again, this wasn't meant, that's sort of a rough dive. It's not meant to be a deep dive, just trying to give a shape of the debate. Now for the sort of main point I want to make about where the debate's at. There are simply too many questions falling under this recipe identity umbrella for which a single answer is being provided. And that's what needs to change. So here are some of the questions that seem to be going on. There's an origination question, which is when a recipe comes into existence. There is a being question, which is what makes an entity a recipe rather than something else. Essence questions, if there are anything that's essential to a recipe. Persistence, which is how recipes survive over time. Distinctness, what makes one recipe distinct from others. Sameness, whether two instances of recipes are the same recipe. And then lastly, a survival question, what sorts of changes can a recipe tolerate and still be the same? This is a sort of rough smattering. I think there can be more questions. These can be broken down into even more parts themselves. It does enough, I think, to give you a general flavor that there's a great many questions here which will be given a one size fits all answer. Uh, if you think about sort of the most well-known identity debates, so the personal identity debate, if you think about the many responses that have been given, you can understand just how differently all these questions have been treated. And as much so, the take home here is that we shouldn't offer or feel the need to offer a one size fits all response when it comes to questions about recipe identity. In the personal identity debate, there's only one there's only one answer that's one size fits all. Uh, Generally speaking, these all get quite different responses. I would love to be able to argue that in principle you can't offer a one size fits all response, but you can. That argument can't be made. So the argument should really be that you shouldn't be offering a one size fits all response. I won't do enough work here to demonstrate that that's the case, short of pointing out that when you see the various kinds of failings in especially the sort of the two views we just looked at, that the struggles they run into are precisely because they do differently well based on these kinds of questions. And so if we stop trying to offer a one size fits all, you can answer various parts of these questions with various different kinds of answers. And by combining them or picking and choosing and selecting where they go, they're going to fare a lot better than they do as general one size fits all. Given that, let me now shift to a sort of positive side of what I want to offer here, uh, which is very much half baked, but hopefully you can get the flavor of it. So we heard about the Sazerac to start. I won't tell this again, but let me add an extra feature. The history of the Sazerac is very much tied to the history of New Orleans itself. 2008, it was named the official cocktail of New Orleans. Uh, it's one of a few cities in the US that have an official cocktail. Kentucky having adopted the old fashioned, and Phoenix, the Phoenix, which was made for it. Um, and Maryland, the state, has the Orange Crush, a drink I know nothing about. Okay, two other cocktail examples. The Gibson. The Gibson looks, if you're not very familiar, exactly like a classic gin martini. They look identical with one small difference. So the Gibson is garnished with a pickled onion. That's the only standard difference. Sometimes there's a minor difference in that some people like to include in a classic martini a dash of orange bitters, and those are almost never included in a Gibson. But generally speaking, the main difference is that martinis get olives or twists and Gibsons get onions. The origins are unclear. It first appears in a recipe book in 1908, but the present version of the cocktail took form after Prohibition, so later than that. There's these two origin stories that you could find out there in the history world about fellows named Gibson who were picky about their martini bills. And one of them apparently thought that onions would keep the doctor away, so just preferred that his martini had an onion in it. Uh, it. At some point, it looks like the Gibson is just a riff on the martini and the martini is kind of flexible, famously. There's lots of different ways you can extend that recipe. But over time, social uptake says what was once a riff now stands proudly alone. So mixologists, famous mixologist Souther Teague, likes to speak of this tradition he refers to as Gib Sunday, where he has a Gibson each Sunday. Sounds lovely, actually. And lastly, a very contemporary classic, the Paper Plane, invented by Sam Ross 2008. It's a summer drink designed to make use of Nonino Amaro. It has lemon juice, bourbon, Nonino, and Aperol. Like most of the recipes, you can swap in your bourbon. You can use whatever lemons you have on hand. You can swap out the Aperol for a nearby substitute, or certainly a cheaper one. And it's flexible, but according to Ross, Nonino is the only acceptable Amaro. It's the only one that gives the cocktail its distinctive pink hue. It changes the flavor. And he worked with tip-top proper cocktails to bring a canned version in just this past year. Okay, so What's this idea of a custodian? Well, I'm going to suggest that recipes at some stage, some of them, certainly not all of them, have custodians, people who are installed, who are in charge of making decisions about the evolution, perhaps the essential features, and the direction of various kinds of recipes. So a custodian is a person or a group or a populace or a corporation or even sometimes a place, which sort of indirectly it's the people, installed as what I call semi-authorities over most of the post-origin aspects of recipes. This has some sort of affinity to work that there's a paper by Borghini and Gandolini where they're talking about sort of divisions in the recipe space that seem to deal with sort of authority figures that I think are very much close to this notion of custodians and custodianship. I mean, their concerns are different, but I think it's the same thing. So it's custodians who propose what, if anything, ought to be the essential aspects of a cocktail and its recipe. They suggest the facts that determine answers to questions about how recipes can and cannot change. And though they are rarely the agents of change or revolution themselves, they're involved in how these impact cocktail and recipe identity. That's it. I think the way that custodianship works is very much a two-way street. So everything custodians might do is really proposal based. Everything that is a suggested can't be a decision made without approval. And approval comes in the form of social uptake, which is something that's judged over time. So custodial decisions are ones which relevant social groups ultimately agree. So agreement tends not to be itself an intentional process. Whether or not certain norms become entrenched in a portion of the populace is really something anyone can intend. So we've got this kind of give and take of individuals to whom we seem to grant this role of custodianship over particular recipes, and then a sort of uptake social role in terms of whether those decisions are then sort of ratified in the greater or the relevant populace of consumers. And uh, these come in different degrees. There are cases that I describe as the kind of clean cases where it's very obvious that we defer custodianship to a particular individual and uptake follows directly because we've done so. There's other cases where it's not clear if anyone is seemed to do this work, and uptake really is going on. And then there's plenty of cases where there's nothing like a custodian at all. So there's nobody we're looking to sort of guide or make decisions ahead of time about how a particular cocktail or recipe evolves. They just do. So in some of those cases, the thing sort of looks in reverse a lot like what happens in sort of evolutionary biology, where lots of events take place, and whether or not event counts as some sort of speciation event is a fact that we can only determine after the fact when we look to see what's happened to that relevant group. So, in these evolutionary stories, you see some sort of physical barrier or some sort of branching off. Maybe there's sort of a land bridge, and so a portion of a population becomes physically removed from the rest of them. Whether or not that counts as a speciation event is not something that's determined at that time. It's about whether or not that group is able to then reconnect, or whether this then imposes other kinds of differences about, various features of them, or whether they can still interbreed and such. So it's always retroactive that you determine that this event that took place, this sort of, disappearing land bridge or what have you, was in fact that kind of an event. I think sometimes in the space of custodianship, we do the same thing there, where custodians are things that come in after the fact. Okay, so in the clean cases, decision and uptake involve recipes created by living and engaged mixologists to whom we then defer. This is very much, I think, the kind of picture that the constructivist wants us to have when the constructivist leans into downstream identity pictures. So in the paper plane case, Ross is the creator. He is the custodian, at least for now, because he's living and engaged. He has the custodial power to dictate that Nonino Amaro is the essential ingredient. He also dictates that the other ingredients are only type level essential, meaning that you can swap in whatever brands of bourbon you like, but you can't, on pains of no longer preparing a paper plane, sub in scotch. This is something he dictates. Again, you could violate this. It could be that in time people start building scotch-based paper planes. Eventually, some form of decision is made through just sort of general uptake as to whether or not this thing gets renamed or whether it deserves to be something else. But the way the sort of negotiation operates at present, we would defer to Ross, and if these things are around, he would be asked, is this thing a paper plane? And based on what he said so far, no, it wouldn't be like a, I don't know, get some new name. Dirty cases. As I say, they resemble the speciation events that we study in evolutionary biology. And they're not the sorts of things you can identify at the time. So, leaning into the Gibson case, we don't know who invented the Gibson. We have no idea. So, this sort of classic model of custodianship through authorship isn't available. We know that Sother Teague is a huge fan, and he's not its custodian, but he could become it. So he himself likes to experiment with versions of the Gibson that replace the pickled onion with other pickled vegetables. He spends a great amount of time and energy pickling things so that he can put them in his Gibsons. There is no custodian proposing that this is beyond the boundaries of the Gibson recipe. But the change might be the sort of change that time can show to have been a speciation event for the Gibson. So this is forward-looking now. So imagine that pickled green beans become a popular substitution for Gibsons, and that bars across Vermont standardly replace the pickled onion in this way. Knowing his fondness for the Gibson, someone might ask Teague if this, Vermonter modification is a Gibson or if it's a cocktail in its own right. If he replies that the Gibson is flexible, then, assuming the relevant uptake, the Gibson now has a more flexible garnish. His proposal is ratified, and so he's retroactively sort of made the custodian backwards looking. Of course, it could go totally different ways. It could be that these pickled beans, which are called dilly beans, give rise to a new drink called the dilly. It really depends on whether the uptake is there and whether that gains the interest, in the same way that the Gibson itself did. All right. Like I say, some cases, in fact, most cases, recipes don't have custodians at all and won't ever have them. Such was the case for the Sazerac. So in the original story of the Sazerac, it's just sort of meandering through a series of happy and unhappy accidents until it ends up where it is today. Uptake is just given by the New Orleans populace, who are continuing to drink modified versions each time as Sazeracs. By 2008, the legislature changes this. So you get this kind of fixing. By making the Sazerac the official cocktail of New Orleans now becomes the custodian of the Sazerac. What'll be interesting to see is I doubt we're going to meet any of the kind of evolutionary pressures that normally fall on cocktails anytime soon. But I would love as a test case if something were to come along and say, if modifications start to rise up to see what sort of happens as to whether the Sazerac can now evolve further. I suspect, given the shape of how these things tend to go, that because it's gained this city-based custodian, that it can no longer go through changes of the sort that got it where it is. It's somewhat paradoxical, in fact, because, part of the reason that New Orleans has adopted this as their citywide cocktail is because it sort of maps the history. You can sort of see the growth of the city. It's very much tied into their identity as a city. But it does so because it was this sort of evolving, changing drink that survived these different kind of changes. Now, with a custodian status applied to the city for the drink, it's most likely the case that they're going to fix it in a way that it's sort of impervious to evolution, which seems to run sort of contrary to what was going on before. Okay. That I think is all I really wanted to say. I will just briefly mention for the sake of completeness, the sort of naturalism that I think I want to introduce in terms of origination is a view that's just open to various kinds of origination views, that treats wild cases and standard invention cases. That's really a kind of, I would call it a hybrid of the two views, but the views are sort of against each other. So it brings in elements of both. It recognizes that most of the extant views do have perfectly good features of how recipes are originated when we know it. And so we're not going to be limiting ourselves. But mostly what I care about is that we take this debate and think about it as having a great many distinct features, and that we are open to and interested in offering a great many distinct kind of answers to all these kinds of questions. Thanks.